So, a very good morning to all of you, and thank you for sparing some time from your hectic academic calendar and discussing something as quaint as the G20. So, how many of you had heard of G20 last year? Not this year, last year, 2022. 50%, right? Half of you had heard, half of you had not heard. Unfortunately, all of you will know by the end of this lecture about the G20. Okay, now look, I'm going to break my presentation to you in 4 parts. First part, I'm going to try and share with you some big trends, 3 of them, that are shaping the world of today. 3 big trends that are defining the world we live in, what we need to respond to, why we need partnerships. Are partnerships possible? I am then going to take a step down and look at perhaps the 3 big challenges that confront all of us that we need to try to respond to. And finally, I will give you 3 propositions that India is making through this particular year as the true word of the G20 as under its G20 presidency. The 3 big trends that are shaping the world of today, I will say the first is what I call the political collision that is underway. We are colliding. We are colliding as geographies. We are changing the political map of the world, which has consequential impact on governance structures, institutions, arrangements, treaties, even norms and assumptions that used to underwrite the world of yesterday. For example, the Indian Ocean, the ocean named after my country, where I was born, is perhaps less important today than the Indo-Pacific is. For example, so when you were in the world where the Indian Ocean was the most important maritime body for a country like India, you invested in building institutions like the Indian Ocean Rim Association. For example. You created a collective of 28 countries, all connected to the ocean, trying to talk about maintaining peace, fisheries, climate issues, development, gender, questions that those 28 odd or 20 odd countries grappled with in that particular region. It was a focused group, focused governance, focused solutions, focused conversations. But today, it's now the Indo-Pacific. Do we even have an institution for the Indo-Pacific? It's a contested body. The Chinese rejects the whole conception, architecture, and the partnerships that are emerging. Many other countries stay away and try to hedge their bets. We have the Quad that has emerged: India, Australia, US, and Japan, who actually came together so that they could be 4 pillars of trying to come up with an architecture for the future. It is not a grouping that is embraced by everyone, but increasingly many countries are beginning to participate in a Quad plus arrangement. Could be on technology, could be on climate, could be on supply chains, could be on trade, could be perhaps also on economic matters. Asia and Europe are colliding. Eurasia is real now. Eurasia is no longer the Russian sphere of influence, but Eurasia is actually 2 continents that implicate each other dramatically. When the Middle East burns, you have challenges in Europe. When a European war happens, all of us bear the brunt. Energy prices, food, inflation, and the Atlantic Ocean, as the Arctic melts, is going to complete the 3rd side of the same maritime body. Indian Ocean, Pacific, Arctic, and Atlantic are going to become a connected lake that's going to have a small and troubled geography that it engulfs. So what happens when politics collide, when continents meet, when maritime bodies converge? What it really does is it puts into place an architecture that conflates different cultural context, different economic realities, different development trajectories. And each of those brings with it its own political systems. And today we are seeing a competition of whether China should define the future of Eurasia, whether we have Western Europe and EU that should be defining the rules of this big landmass. Should the Western Pacific architecture of the US dominate the Indian Ocean? Or should the BRI and the Chinese partnerships dominate it? Or should India find its third way and own way? So there is a jostling that is taking place courtesy these political collision, but basically multilateralism as we knew it is dead. Institutions as we knew it are no longer competent to respond to this. The United Nations is a bystander and a spectator. And small clubs, a term called club lateralism, are trying to stitch together a kaleidoscope of rules and norms and laws that will govern our future. So that's the one big trend. Politics as we know it is dead. New politics has been given birth, and no one has a clue of where it is going to take us. So it's a very rich time to be a social scientist, academic, a think tanker. This is our golden period. And everyone is lost, then no one criticizes us for being the only ones who are lost. It is a good time to be writing, reading, and researching what could emerge from the political mess that we are. The second collision or the second trend that we are witnessing today is the collapse of the distinction between, and this is important, the distinction between the virtual and the real. Our digital lives are no longer distinct from our real lives. The mobile phone is no longer an instrument. It is life itself. The digital world decides who we date in our real life. The coding, the hashtags, the algorithms, they tell you which boy or girl to swipe left or right. Perhaps they also decide the vehicle that you will sit in as you go to your first date. It also decides the venue that you will choose for that first date. And eventually the Instagram folks will tell you what is the good meal to have, what is hot, what is not. So basically today, we are programmed by the machine and we are no longer the programmers. There is a collapse, but it also means that the same algorithms decide who we choose in our elections, who we vote for, what we wear, how we should be appearing, what should be the body forms. All aspects of human existence today are influenced by, sometimes decided by, the digital environment that we inhabit. It is virtual, but it has real consequences. We fight, we have riots, we have hate, we have wars, many of which colored, shaped, injected into our realities through the virtual medium. And again, in the real world, we had an idea called the nation state. Constitutions, laws, norms, control over expression of speech, censorship, all sorts of local realities that created an order. The nation state was the provider of order. A rules-based order, a term that we hear sometimes, was nothing but multiple nation states enforcing that order. And a conversation amongst those nation states became an international order, the UN. But in the virtual world, no nation exists. Platforms don't recognize boundaries. American-styled speech is today prevalent on Indian platforms as well. We don't care about holding ourselves back. In the real world, when we were growing up, we were told different community, different culture, different folks, be careful, don't poke them in their eyes, don't box them in the nose. But in the digital world, we do that every day. Where is that restraint that created communities and considered friendships, conditional friendships, even if we were to be harsh on what we did in the past century? In today's world, we say what we feel like. So there's a collapse of the virtual and real, and we are unable to agree on anything. In fact, those we agree with become the small community that we inhabit. The world, even as it expands in terms of the people we can reach, has shrunk because we are choosing the few that we agree with. Our hashtags have become our country. And polarization has become the norm. each of us contributes to. So that's the second big trend, where it is a world which is highly partitioned to digital walls. We all live in walled gardens. And when we try to meet together as a global community, consensus will elude us. The third big trend, again a collision. I think I like the word collision this morning. The third big trend is the conflict between planet and people. The planet is fed up. It is angry. And the planet is hitting back. Climate change is not a future prediction. It is something we are living through now. Adverse events, intense catastrophes, unseasonal rainfalls, droughts, leading to famines and agriculture stresses, water security, water insecurity. These are all real questions of our time. It is not something that's going to happen in 2030 or 2050 or 2070. It happened in 2010, 28, 27, last century as well. Some people are likely to suffer more. Some communities have more resources to respond to the changes underway. The impact of this battle between planet and people is going to be uneven. It's going to have deleterious consequences on some. It is going to be manageable in other instances. Some see this as a zero-sum game. Some see this as a game to make money, intellectual property for climate technologies, business models around renewable energy, and a whole new world of responding to this climate phenomenon has emerged. Our energy has a climate consideration. Our food has a climate consideration. Sustainable fashion is the new word that's really doing the rounds. Everything is now affected, implicated, shaped by our relationship with this with the planet. And add to that the development challenges of poverty, of malnourishment, of exclusions of women and other communities from economic processes. This planetary contest is the third big trend. Sources for which there is now a clear and cutthroat competition for. And institutions that promise to deliver development to all are struggling to do that. In fact, recent reports suggest that we have not even reached the quarter mark in our SDG goals. We are halfway through and we have not even reached 25% in terms of the journey we should have traversed by now. In fact, in the last few years, there's been a backsliding. More people have gone back into poverty than been lifted out of poverty. For the first time, we have faced an increase in poor people, then a decrease. Now, this is the backdrop of G20. So when we call 20 countries to try and carve together a common pathway for the future, this is what we are dealing with. We are dealing with a world largely, I'm being a little dramatic, that's just to get your attention, but it's true. I'm not being overly dramatic. This is the context in which we are all going to meet to try and stitch together some common propositions for our common future. And in some ways, the Indian ethic or the Indian proposition, the big proposition was exactly this. One earth, one family, one future. That even though we are in these very difficult moments of our geopolitical history, we still have to stitch together a symphony that will lead us all to our future that is undoubtedly interlinked and indeed the same. So the three big questions that we needed to respond to and that have become a part of the Indian G20 agenda flow from these big trends. The first has to be on investing in political institutions, in multilateral institutions, in globalization itself, so that more and more people can benefit from this interconnectedness. So reform of multilateral systems, investing in new multilateral formats, in reviving some of the old development banks and international financial institutions is one of the big Indian focus at its G20 presidency under the rubric of the reform of the multilateral system. So whether it is the MDB banks, whether it is the UN, whether it is WTO, whether it is intellectual property organizations, whether it is the World Health Organization, etc. A cluster of international institutions and international arrangements need revival, need investments into, and need to be made fit for the 21st century, fit for the world that we are trying to respond to today. And that is one big Indian focus, priority under its G20 presidency. And you can hear multilateral reforms and UN debates from Prime Minister to the Foreign Minister to various other functionaries. You would see this emphasis in discussions. The second, of course, has to be a digital future. Technology promises to lift millions out of poverty. India itself has been a big beneficiary of technology. How many of you use Google Pay or RuPay or any payment system? I think everyone uses it, right? Now, who would have thought 5 years ago this would be the case? We have seen technology make our lives easier, make our lives more productive. We have connected people to banks and financial institutions that had absolutely no chance of access to those old world institutions. We have used technology to make it happen. We are giving loans based on digital footprints of your transactions. Women find it easier to access credit today. I'm not saying it's perfect or equal, but I'm saying it's better than it used to be. We've seen technology lift millions and millions out of poverty. Yet, we know technology is still an elite domain. It still benefits those who have education and literacy, those who have access to enterprises and businesses, more than those who are living in the margins of our societies. So the second big question is, how can we prevent the technology and digital domain to become the preserve of the elite and the rich, and how can the benefits of innovation serve the next 7 billion? European and American innovation helped the first 1 billion people in the world, some of them also in India. But the next 7 billion will require a different architecture. One that is affordable, one that is multilingual so that it caters to them in their own languages, one that is gender friendly so that women are not bullied online and they see this as a safe space and they can conduct their businesses, one that does not disregard cultural context of people and therefore makes them afraid of participating in our public sphere. Many of our institutions are unfriendly. It's not as if we exclude anyone, but because we are all dressed in a particular way, we eat in a particular way, we converse in a particular way, some people find our lives intimidating. Even though there is nothing to stop them from coming into this classroom, they would be scared of joining us here. Digital world is also like that. At a much bigger scale, we scare some people away from participating. So how can we create the idea of digital public infrastructure where the undergirding of the internet, the innovation of the internet, the facilities of the technology and digital age are available to all, and we could create contextual solutions including such as the UPI or health stacks or education stacks in different languages for different communities, for the fisherman community, for the agri community, it could create context. So India's Digital Public Infrastructure Initiative, the idea of actually making it accessible to all at affordable cost, which means literally zero costs, so that others could build their enterprises on top of that. You have India experimenting with payments, which is now free. Literally all of you transact for free. Everyone can afford it. You have India creating a similar model for Amazon-styled ONDC, which is basically a digital retail architecture that allows any vendor to use the tech internet without having to share profits with Amazon, right? So they are creating a similar retail model. We have health and insurance and education and multiple such models coming up. And we want this to become a global public good. And can we make this available to the next 7 billion people in different geographies, including Asia, Africa, Latin America, and also parts of Europe, by the way. We keep talking about the excluded, but please believe me, There are enough excluded people even in the United States of America. Let me give you an example. Just look at what happened during the pandemic. In New York City, if you were in the Upper East Side, you had literally zero fatalities. But if you were in Harlem, you were dying more than you were dying in India. So the blacks and Latinos in the American system are their excluded people. And they are not, they don't have access to the privileges that people living in the Upper East Side in New York City do. So if you look at the PIN codes and the mortality rates during the pandemic in America, you would see the third world within the richest country in the world. So access to technology, because our future is digital, is an essential element to lift people, to give them opportunities, to engage with them. And the second Indian big agenda is around tech. Tech for development, data for development, data for women-led entrepreneurship, startups that are controlled by women founders or defined by women founders. All of this, the big digital agenda, is one of the Indian propositions and challenges as well, right? And the third challenge, of course, before us, which became part of the agenda, is around climate change, right? So you have multilateralism, the political system, because of the political collision. You have tech because of the collapse of the virtual and the real, and then you have a climate response. Now, typically in the past, in the climate response, and I'll just hurry up so that we have enough time for Q&A. Typically in the past, every big leader of the world who has stood before a mic has had to make one promise. They have said, we will invest so much in green, we'll put so much money into renewables, we'll do so much for reducing emissions. But at the end, they used to always say one line. For example, the most left of center American presidents, the most cool and woke president, President Obama, even when he made climate pledges and climate commitments, he used to end his speech by saying, we will defend the American way of life. Well, that is the problem. You're defending something that is not climate friendly. American way of life is the one that has led us to this planetary crisis. And yet every American president, Republican or Democrat, would say the American way of life will not be compromised. Actually, guess what? We need to compromise your life if we need to respond to climate change. Prime Minister Modi, or everything else that India is doing on climate, has for the first time, a big country leader, for the first time has said, our lifestyles will change. We have to rethink our life itself. And therefore he had come up with he had coined a term called lifestyle for environment. We'll have to rethink how we eat, what we consume, what we wear, how we spend, what we invest into. Our way of lives are absolutely under the scanner, and they will have to change if we have to win this battle. And we have to save the planet and save the species. The lifestyle for environment, which has now become lifestyle for sustainable development, because the Chinese wanted some change. They just don't like our terms. Actually, they don't like more than that, but that's a different debate. So lifestyle for environment, or focusing on mobilizing people and their creativity and making them part of the climate agenda, is something that we are trying to do. We are trying to take the climate debate to the people, and we are wanting people to join and become part of climate response. So for the first time, the climate debate has moved from financial promises and financial institutions and government commitments and national determined contributions to the retail scale. We have taken climate change to the retail level. All of us are now part of that response. That is the third proposition, that how do we mobilize young people, old people, all sorts of people, to try and become part of the climate army that is going to respond to this challenge. And again, as we do this, we have to think about it's not just about carbon. It's about food. It's about biodiversity. It's about other species who can't join the debate, who can't argue for themselves. It's about a much larger gamut of issues that we need to talk about. So a big focus on resilience, diversity, adaptation, and of course, conservation is part of the Indian agenda. We have changed the climate debate from one being narrowly focused on solar power plants to one that is about preserving the planet and saving the planet in its entirety. It's not about making money from the green business. It's actually about ensuring we have jobs as we go green, we have growth as we go green, we have food as we go green. And we save the species that we have inherited as the most prolific and perhaps even the most predatory species on this planet. So, three big challenges. How do we get the tech formula right? How do we get political institutions to respond to our time? And how do we create a climate consensus? Right? And this agenda, all of this that I've just said, has been packaged and offered through different means in the Indian presidency. I'll just list three of them. The first, I would argue that because of the very nature of the agenda and the issues that are being discussed, India had to be innovative with the formats it would create to take this conversation forward during the year. We have ended up, perhaps by design and by enthusiasm of our entire country, by the way, we've become the first people's G20. G20 is now no longer something that only the South Bloc and North Bloc and the officials engage with, but we have taken it to the students, to the youth, to regions, all parts of India, different languages. The Think 20 that I steered as the chair of the Secretariat, we have been to 15 states, we have hosted 80 conversations, we have produced 300 plus policy briefs written by 1,000 plus authors from 750 research institutions, comprising 45% women, including women. This kind of prolific participation in a Think 20 is unprecedented. We created something called the ideas box. Everyone can't write a paper, but people have good ideas. So we created an ideas box where you could use 300 words to communicate something important to us directly. Tens of thousands of ideas have been received by us. Many of them have found place in the final communique submitted to the Think Tank 20 communique submitted to the government. 75 odd countries have contributed to this process. It is no longer just the G20. It's 75 countries. So this is the first people's G20. And that was our first proposition. The first Indian flavor added to what's happening. We now have millions of young people aware of it. It doesn't end here. They will also chase this process. Some of them will have been onboarded onto this process, and as they grow in their careers, they will be traveling to Brazil and South Africa and every other country that is going to be hosting the G20. So we have literally let loose an Indian cohort who has got enticed by some of these global conversations and processes, and we hope you will see a lot more of India in every subsequent presidency. So we want India present in these conversations, in numbers, in the Women 20, in the Think 20, in the Business 20, in the Youth 20, in the Startup 20. Some 20s we have given birth to here only. So it's a people's G20. And I think that's an important proposition. The second proposition, and this is equally important, that we have chosen the mode of evolution rather than revolution. We are speaking about reformed multilateralism, and unlike some in the world who want to actually discard the old and they want to do away with the UN, and there are questions asked, is the UN relevant? Is the multilateral system effective? Is it even needed? We have reaffirmed the faith in multilateralism and multilateral institutions, although we have continued to say that they are unfair and they privilege only a few. Despite not being part of the apex body of the UN Security Council at the UN, and despite demanding it quite loudly for a number of decades, we still continue to repose faith in an institution, and we are putting our energy in saving those. So whether it is the spring meetings of the World Bank, whether it is the UNGA and the UN High-Level Week that is coming up later this month, we have continued to link up our G20 with those processes, COP28 for climate. We have supported, complemented, and injected ideas into the older formats and older institutions to make them more relevant for modern times, rather than choose the revolutionary route of making them redundant and making them less relevant to what we seek to do. So multilateralism and defense of globalization is important for India. The older economies, the richer economies don't care about globalization anymore. America has come up with an industrial policy. They used to beat up India because we used to have industrial policy. America has come up with Inflation Reduction Act. That is the policy to keep manufacturing at home. It is to become the hydrogen hub of the world. They are subsidizing the industries to make them competitive with other industries and with other geographies. Everything that they told us not to do, they are doing at home. Europe, carbon border adjustment mechanism is a way to make European industry competitive. Again, they used to come and tell us, why are you doing this? Why are you closing your borders? Why are you not allowing free trade and free flow of economic exchanges? They are doing it themselves. Why? Because they have $50,000 per capita income, $60,000 per capita income. Globalization has served the purpose for them. Now it is drawing value out of them. They are not going to defend globalization and multilateralism in the future. We will have to do it. We have to grow from $2,500 per capita to 5,000 and 10,000. It is our burden to now fuel a new wave of globalization, a new future for multilateralism, and a new international engagement for the future. It is India's responsibility. We have free ridden on Western infrastructure, Western banks, Western processes. We will have to invest in them ourselves. And Indian G20 presidency, from its tagline to its agenda, is actually an Indian determination to be one of the facilitators of the next wave of globalization, of multilateralism, and of international engagement. And finally, we have made the idea of Global South sexy. Global South used to be described by Western commentators as being a place where you have poverty, misery, lawlessness, crime, misgovernance, bad governance, all sorts of terrible things. Put them into one basket and say this is Global South. So 125 odd countries in the world, which comprise roughly what we define as the Global South, were described in these terms. We have reclaimed our identity using this G20 from the OECD countries, from the developed countries. We have defined for ourselves who we are. Yes, we are the Global South, but guess what? Global South is green, Global South is tech, Global South is gender, Global South is globalization. We should not allow the Western world, which has destroyed this planet, which has emitted carbon more than anyone else, to become green evangelists. They have no business to preach green. We are green. At 2 tons per capita footprint of carbon, we are a tenth of any of the OECD countries. We are even a third or fourth of China. We are probably the fraction is much higher if you take the Middle East, but I'm not going there. But what it basically means is there is no other $3.5 trillion economy in the world that has emitted less carbon than us. There are only 4 or 5 countries who are of that size, but we would have emitted less carbon to get to $3.5 trillion than anyone else. Our carbon intensity of economic growth is one of the best in the world. We have the right to tell the world how to have green growth. People who have 20 tons per capita footprint should not be preaching to us. Similarly, tech first. Their technology serves the rich. Our technology serves everyone. We can talk about being the first tech first $3.5 trillion economy, a digitally driven $5 trillion economy, a digital first $10 trillion economy. So we are a digital first country, and many like us in the Global South are also the same. We have challenges on gender, big challenges. But I'm so happy that in this presidency, we have made that a focal point. So even though we struggle with it, we have shouted out loud that this has to be the promise. And I think there are 2 outcomes that are possible because of this. A, the world starts focusing more because it's coming from a country like ours, which possibly has to do the most on this particular issue. So we are not shying away from talking about something that is our underbelly, a dark underbelly. We are taking it up front and center in our agenda. But second, because we have set it out so many times and in so many forums under the G20 presidency, we might also achieve some national understanding and empathy and perhaps even a consensus. Because India is not just one monolithic government sitting in New Delhi. India is administered in its blocks, in its districts, in its states. So I think We have made Global South take charge of the big 4 or 5 things that matter to us that I described at the very beginning of my talk: globalization and multilateralism, green growth and peace with the planet, SDGs and inclusion, and how do we cater to all and no one is left behind, and technology and our digital future. And these are possibly, I have given you maybe a short glimpse, a small glimpse of what's been happening over the past 8 to 9 months. And I thank you for your time.